if I may just add something to the addition, I kind of building up on this whole idea of pride and kind of the condition under which a privileged partnership could happen. There is kind of this idea now among people in Turkey that if, and again I think it's very unlikely, but if something like a privileged partnership would happen, it could only happen if it was an idea coming from the Turkish side. If for some kind of interesting reasons, Turkey realized that the EU project is not as attractive as it used to be, and etc., but still want some kind of thing, some kind of strong association with the EU, they could come up with an idea of, okay, we're not going to go until for the membership. We kind of have another intermediary relationship between the EU. It may be fine, but as long as this is coming from Europe, as long as this is France or Germany kind of pushing for this idea, it's just unacceptable from the Turkish perspective.
Can I just add one thing?
Sure.
And this is the Nixon to China. And if the suggestion comes from the AKP, it will be even harder. The party that would have an easier time making that suggestion is probably the CHP, because at least in the minds, that's associated with the EU, even if, objectively speaking, the AKP has done a lot more to make Turkey an attractive member than the CHP had. But it will be hard. The outcry among the seculars would be extremely harsh, I think, if the suggestion were made by the AKP. There would be a debate also where, if it's made by the CHP, but it would probably be easier for them to do it than for the AKP.
May I just add something? You emphasize the civilizational aspect of this, but Turkey seems to no longer see it in those terms, but rather in whatever works for our interests, national interests.
I would say the Turkish government, I would agree with you. I'm not sure that I would say all of them.
Recent foreign policy initiatives as well. Yeah. So do you see that as an impediment to EU accession process? What I mean is that you think there has to be this commitment larger than serving the national interests at the level of sort of cultural attachment or civilization commitment?
Well, I think it's there. I mean, it's been there for so long. Even if, as I said, the AKP or certain members may not feel it as strongly as it was felt by some in the past, I still think it's that feeling has become a part of the whole effort to become an EU member, and the issue, as I said, of pride and so forth. So it may be true that it's not as strong, and it is true, I would say, that it's not as strong for the AKP, but I think they would have a hard time backing away from it.
Michael Lemon from the Near East South Asia Center. I'd like to try and stoke a bit more controversy in the conversation, if I might. Particularly making the observation that there seems to be very different lenses or mindsets in which European or American commentators and observers look upon Turkey, but also the phenomenon of a larger dynamic in international relations that's shifting. To give specific examples, the shift from a G7, G8 centric observation on the international economic and financial system to more of a G20 centric approach. Now, this is all nascent, it's only beginning. As you see within the larger international system, relative shifts in power, relative, not absolute. I'm not into an argument about declines or accessions, but as those relative power shifts occur, the terms of discourse, the terms of how one interacts on fundamental questions also shifts. My sense is that when one talks to the transatlantic commentariat, that they are still wedded to an old paradigm, and old terms of reference, an older framework that has yet to make this, or accede to this gradual transition that's underway in the larger international system. And when one goes out to the Middle East, to Turkey, to Asia, you get a very different optic when you're talking to your host interlocutors in terms of how they see and interpret the world. Bringing it back to this particular topic, how do you analyze that playing itself out in terms of Turkey-EU relationships and where that might go in the future? Is the EU becoming perhaps less relevant or central to Turkey's conception of itself in the out years, where it fits in the world, where it fits in its region? Or do you continue to make the argument that the EU at least has symbolically and emotionally and politically a heavy weighting in that context?
Both, but let me come back to the original. First, you're not going to get an argument from me on what you said, because I agree with it. I think that there is a difference between the way the world has been changing globally in the last decade or more, 2 decades. And there is a problem with a lot of U.S. thinking about Turkey, which is still mired in many cases in an image of Turkey, at least in my view, that no longer corresponds to what Turkey is and so forth. And that has some relevance to why the AKP came to power. And I think in many cases, people were not watching the underlying social and economic trends of the last decade, which helped to explain 2 decades what has been happening in Turkey. And the same with the change in the global economic, the global picture in general. But I think the changes in the global side have in fact reinforced Turkey's importance, and are one of the reasons why it is becoming a more important regional and to some extent global actor. And the fact that it's the 16th or 17th largest economy in the world is a reflection of the way in which Turkey has been changing. And I think that what you've seen is, along with this, a rising self-confidence of Turkey as a more independent actor. Now, that doesn't mean that the EU and the West are not important anymore. But the worldview is changing. They are one factor. They're not as important as they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but they're still very important. But there are other. Turkey now has stakes and interests in various areas, particularly the Middle East, the Caucasus, to some extent Central Asia, which it simply didn't have 20 years ago, before the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War had a number of, I would argue, important impacts on Turkey. First, it didn't eliminate, but it reduced the importance of the United States for Turkish security. Again, didn't eliminate it. The U.S. still is important, but it was no longer as important as when the Soviet Union was the main threat. Secondly, it opened up a number of areas to Turkish diplomacy which had been more or less off limits. Central Asia, Caucasus, to some extent the Balkans, and the Middle East. And because Turkey now has these interests, it is less willing, understandably in my view, to automatically fall in line with everything the United States says in the way that it was willing to do when there was one overriding threat and the United States played a different role. Today there are, as you say, other emerging powers, of which Turkey in its own way is one, but India, China, Brazil, others. And that whole dynamic of the way the international system is changing in fact, I would argue works to Turkey's advantage, and to give the AKP credit, which some people wouldn't. I think Davutoglu and some others have understood the way in which this international system is changing and have tried to adjust to it. Now, I don't agree with everything they've done, but I would say conceptually, I think they have recognized the important ways in which this international system has changed and have tried to adapt Turkey's role to it.
Just a couple more questions.
You can take that.
Yes.
Yeah. My name is Anwar Adama from Liberty and Social Justice, Algeria. And indeed, Turkey is an interesting case for us in the Muslim world. Yes, I understand that Turkey needs to do some homework in order to fulfill the criteria to be for the membership. But don't you think that also Europe need to do a lot in order to adjust with the growing population from the non-Christian cultural values, like the Muslim population that is growing, European Muslim populations, the Chinese that are coming in as well? I mean, don't you sense that there is a problem in Europe itself to adjust with this new diverse world that we are living in the future? And maybe Turkey will be helping in that. Because economically speaking, even having 30% of the population being in the agriculture, it could be seen as being an asset actually, and not for the European, etc. So don't you think the problem also is Europe should do something? They should do some homework as well to adjust and to accommodate for this changing world?
I think yes, but I'd like to turn the question over to you.
Can I take a couple
Yes.
more questions?
Okay.
I don't want to run out of. Yes.
I'm Russell Hardo from Tusia. My question is mainly for Juliette, but I could do Stephen's view as well. Following the decision in the Legal Affairs Committee in the EU for direct trade with Northern Cyprus, do you see any avenue for in the near future for the EU to open direct trade?
Yes.
Any question in response to what Dr. Larrabee said? I was curious what percentage of JHP voters, CHP voters, do you think actually support the European Union accession process? My name is Reagan Abdegraf. I just recently returned from doing field research in Turkey. And what I found out, or what seemed to be the case, is there's nobody really supportive of EU membership. It was an irrelevant topic in Turkey. And that there were people who were actually CHP voters that had gone over to vote for AKP because of this new ambitious foreign policy. I'm curious, what percentage of CHP voters do you think actually still support EU membership enough to generate some sort of outcry, and where the support for the EU actually is? And then also, if both of you could comment on the fact that generally when we look at the AKP voting bloc, support within the AKP seems to have been lost after 2005 and the headscarf decision of the European Court of Human Rights and whatnot. Those voters seem to be more pro-European, and now they don't care either. So where's the support domestically in Turkish politics for the EU? Because I don't see it right now.
Yes.
Michael Kurzik. I'd just like to take the other side of the gentleman from Algeria who spoke. It seems to me, and that's why I'd like to have your opinion, shouldn't it be the people who come to Europe to adjust to European customs and European laws? And I know that Prime Minister Merkel said multiculturalism doesn't work, which is a very serious comment made in this thing. But it seems to me if you come to a country, you adjust to them. Don't ask them to adjust to you. I'd like to have an opinion on that.
Any more questions? I have one question about just Turkey's foreign policy. You mentioned that Iran sanctions did create a lot of criticism. Turkey is increasingly saying that it would like to actually be proactive in the region, but it's also sort of copying the EU's neighborhood policy. What would you say about do you find that a convincing argument, and if not, why did we have the Europeans react to the sanctions vote in that manner? Okay, so we have 5 questions already. The first one about the EU's internal Muslim population immigration issue. Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So on the two questions regarding diversity within Europe, isn't it Europe that should also have a lot of homework to do? And then kind of the counter question, or isn't it actually? It's a very big and broad question regarding the whole issue of immigration and integration and kind of cultural diversity and identity and one of the things that I kind of wanted to mention earlier is this question is always tied to the Turkey membership issue, which I understand to some extent, but I also think it's quite overstated in the sense that, like, if Turkey were to be part of the EU, I don't think it's gonna change radically the situation. And this whole fear about if Turkey is in the EU, there's gonna be this mass migration into Western Europe. I think it's clearly overstated. We saw with previous enlargement that you have a little bit of a peak of migration at the beginning, but it's not that massive. And there will probably be some, as for the 10 new countries in 2004, there will probably also be some provisions to kind of prevent this in the first time. So I think there is kind of an overstatement of this issue in kind of domestic politics in Europe. And I also think that to a certain extent, it's actually going to work in the advantage. Like Turkey is going to help a lot. I mean, could help the integration problem in Europe for a set of different reasons. But I think the biggest one is a symbolic one. Basically, if Turkey is in the EU, it will be clear that Europe is not a Christian club. Europe is a political project which is based on values and norms. And I think just this whole idea that yes, Turkey can be as European as anything, will kind of ease the whole kind of Muslim Christian whatever relationship, which I think is more of a symbolical problem than it's a symbolical and then kind of socioeconomic problem, because migrant population tends to be in the lower level of the social ladder. So then I think it could actually ease the relationship. The broader issue of is it only Turkey that needs to make efforts to the EU, or isn't it also the EU that needs to work on that? I would clearly. I'm quite critical of the EU in general, so I would clearly say that yes, the EU has a lot of work to do, and this kind of, I mean, especially on the whole issue of migration in general. The EU has a very paradoxical policy, which I think is overall quite unhealthy, and this kind of ties also with your question to kind of EU's neighborhood policy. Especially, I'm kind of studying a lot the European visa policy and Turkey's visa policy, and it's very interesting to see how Turkey is kind of now opening its borders with most of the countries in the neighborhood. Lots of visa-free agreements. Like in the 90s, kind of Turkey liberalized visa policies towards all the countries of the north, mainly all the Black Sea neighbors. And now it is kind of balancing by doing the same with mainly Middle Eastern countries, but also with Russia recently, which was kind of a very important step. And it's very interesting to kind of hear the reason why the Turkish government is doing that. And this is really based on this idea of, opening the borders is going to help. Is going to help with trade and economic development, and eventually stability. Is going to kind of help, kind of breaking down some of the stereotype and kind of enemy image that we used to have with our neighbors. And this is going to have this positive effect of stability and better relationship in the region. And this whole idea is very much, I mean, it is not a European idea, but it's very much the idea that was applied first, very initially at the very beginning of the European construction, where the whole idea was to, remove all the borders within the EU, which the EU did. And then when more recently the EU started to apply this neighborhood policy, it was also on this idea that, let's open up and kind of help countries in our neighborhood to develop. Except that Europe now Europe is being very successful at doing that internally, but this has been done in parallel with the construction of very strict border control at the external border of the EU. which is creating a whole new set of issues with kind of basically all countries around the Mediterranean and East Europe. And so it's interesting to see how paradoxically, in a way, Turkey is now applying kind of the European idea of kind of visa and open border policy that it was doing. The way it applies also to Iran, I'm not really sure. I think on principle, yes. I think like it used to be kind of traditionally the US was kind of more going towards restrictive policies towards Iran, whereas Europe was more advantageous the diplomatic options. It seemed that Europe is now much more kind of in between, and that the actors advocating the diplomatic options with Iran has become Turkey and Brazil on that particular issue. But I mean, I heard a lot of very contradictory statements on kind of the intricacies of the diplomatic process for that agreement. So I'm not really sure exactly what happened and you know who is right in a way in the position that's been taken after that issue. Shall I go ahead with the other question on the direct trade and yeah, so on the direct trade, I'm not sure what to say. First, it's a very kind of complicated bureaucratic issue within the EU, and from what I understood is now it's pretty much over in the sense that you know a decision has finally been done. You know, it's out of the legal limbo it was for the last 6 years. So I would be quite pessimistic, unfortunately, on that particular small leverage that might have had a big effect. Now, I mean, the other main way of kind of unblocking the situation is for somehow, you know, Turkey, the Republic of Cyprus, and representative of Northern Cyprus to come at the table and kind of find settlements. It might not be a comprehensive settlement of everything, but at least on the port issues and the trade, I don't know, I don't have kind of an easy solution, but it has to be a political solution, I think, now, given that the technical trick didn't work. Now it's going to have to be one which is more political. And on the percentage of CHP voters that might be supporting the EU membership, I really don't have any number or anything, but it just gives me the opportunity to talk a little bit about kind of public opinion in Turkey. And indeed, public opinion in Turkey now is very much either kind of against or at least indifferent to the whole EU membership, which is in contrast of the way it was a couple of years ago, where the support was much stronger. And I think, and this is something I think I was trying to say in the presentation, and I probably kind of spoke a little bit too fast. What I think public opinion, be it in Turkey or in Europe, is very important, and this is very this is probably one of the way that solution or problems will kind of evolve. What I was trying to say is that on both sides, public opinion is very, very malleable, and this is more kind of a demonstration, kind of an effect of the problem rather than really the core of the problem. In Turkey, in particular, public opinion is very, very reactive. You just need, you know, a couple of European leaders saying something nasty about Turkey, and everyone is going to be against Europe. You just need a couple of European leaders something really nice about Turkey, and you will see suddenly support for EU coming back up really fast. So public opinion is really important, and it's very important for political leaders to work on this and to actually lead public opinion as opposed to hide behind public opinion on both sides, both in Europe and in Turkey. But I think it's important to recognize that public opinion is not fixed, and it's something that can change, and sometimes change quite rapidly.
Let me just address that question first, about the CHP support for the EU, or lack thereof. I think it's a very good question, and I think basically you're right that the support for the EU has been declining in the Turkish population in general, but particularly also among CHP voters. I don't know whether I certainly can't give a percentage, but I hear I think the basic point you're making is correct. But like Juliette, I also would say that public opinion is volatile. It has reacted to what it considers to be anti-Turkish sentiment in among the EU members. It's a reaction in a sense of frustration that they feel that the EU continues to move the goalposts and change the requirements as Turkey nears one and gets so far. Then there's a sense that the EU is changing the game, and there's a sense of frustration that Turkey sees the EU as largely a Christian club, and it doesn't matter what they do, they're not going to get. They feel they're not going to get in anyway. And just on that point, what's interesting about the German Marshall Fund and the Pew polls, the last ones that came out, is if you look at the German Marshall Fund poll, there's the support for getting into the EU. If the question is, do you favor getting into the EU on the part of to the Turks, the answer that says yes has declined significantly. But if you ask whether you think they'll get in, most Turks say no. If you ask the Europeans, do you think it's a good idea if Turkey joins? Just the opposite. No. Do you think they'll get in? Yes. So there's a dynamic. But to your point, I think, again, on the part of the CHP, that a lot of what you're hearing does reflect a frustration of the moment, a plague on all your houses. It's like when the girl said, you find out your girlfriend, the girl you want to go out with, doesn't want to go out with you, and then you say, well, I didn't want to go out with her anyway. There's an element of that in there. And then, as Juliette says, if the EU were to change its attitude, I think you would see a rather important shift with the CHP as well. On the other issue, which has to do with who needs to adjust to whom, here I think it's a question. I do think the EU has to make adjustments. I think the United States has to, as I suggested, think differently about. This is not the same Turkey that we were dealing with in the 60s and 70s and 80s. This is a different Turkey with, and we have to adjust, and the EU has to adjust to it as well. On the other hand, you are also right. First of all, if you take it at a certain level, if someone comes and wants to live in the country, then they have to adjust and at least obey the laws. And if they want to join the club, which has certain rules, whether you like the rules or not, you decide either I can swallow the ones I don't like and put up with them, but you have to, if you want to join the club, you're going to have to accept the rules. So I think both of you are right, but it depends on the level of analysis of what you're talking about. Yes, at a certain level, the EU has to make some adjustments, but Turkey itself has to accept that those are the rules of the game, and they will have to be obeyed if they want to get in.
Can I give you each 2 minutes to
I've said all
closing remarks? You didn't answer the question. Has Turkey lost Europe?
I think Turkey is in danger of losing Europe, but I think more importantly, Europe is in danger of losing Turkey. But I don't like the word losing, but we know what's behind that. In other words, I think the danger is that Turkey and the EU are moving apart, and that has negative consequences for the EU, but also obviously for Turkey as well, in my view, and for the United States and other parts of the world as well.
I also don't have particular closing statement, but I just would like to come back to the point that was just before. And this is this works on this whole idea of, who has to adjust to who. And I think this is something that works both for immigrants coming to Europe in European societies and for Turkey as a country joining the EU project. It is true that when you have a new member or someone's joining an existing political order, the most important and the initial step is to kind of accept the system as it is and you know, abide by the rules and the norms and the way society works and the way the political institution works. Yet, once you are in the system, and especially if we're talking about a democratic system, and as long as you do it kind of following the rules of the democratic process, it is also kind of unfair to expect the newcomers not to kind of work through the system to make the changes that they would think is acceptable. And I think this is one of the problems with the whole immigration into Europe, that we would like them to come and just kind of accept everything we are and we are doing, instead of accepting that if we accept them and if they are not part of society and they have, you know, if they have gained citizenship and everything, this is also their democratic right, if they disagree on certain issue, to go through the democratic process and kind of trigger a public debate and try to things change. And this is something that might happen also if Turkey comes within the EU. We know Turkey is not kind of super satisfied with all EU regulation and everything. If Turkey is in, it is also natural to expect Turkey to try within the system to change things that they don't think is fair or is correct.
Okay.